Alrighty. Well, um, yeah. Well, okay. Rocky's having a sleep. As you can see, there he is. He's having a sleep. He's quite the Rocky. He is. He's pretty content right now. He's fast asleep there on the blankets and stuff. Um, all right. Well, I want to address something here that has been an ongoing thing. I just actually answered a comment about this thing, and I wasn't very nice in my answer, but it was because I got frustrated. No doubt I'll be accused of being abusive for the answer I gave. But here's the thing. Rocky will not stay under a blanket. I can put a blanket on top of him, he'll just go out from under it. He does not like being under a blanket. He really doesn't like anything on his body. I once got a breakaway collar for him, and I put the collar on, and he'll let me put anything on him. He'll submit to anything I do. He'll let me put anything on him, but he won't stay on him for very long. But the breakaway collar, I got him up on the couch. This is when I had the apartment in Perth, above the bank. I put the collar on him. Okay, you snap shut, whatever. Put that around his neck. Put the breakaway part at the back of his neck. Well, he let me put it on, and then he jumped down off the couch, and he started rubbing his neck against the side of the couch, and he spun the collar all the way around to the breakaway part was at the front, and then he got both paws up underneath it, and he just did that, and he opened it up, and that was it. See, he will not tolerate having anything on him. I've got to try to figure out how I'm going to get him to stay in a harness when we leave here, and I don't know that I'm going to be able to do it. I'm planning to take him to the pet store and have him fitted with one that hopefully he won't be able to escape, and hopefully he'll get used to it. But again, I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be possible. Every time I've tried to put anything on his body, he does not like it, and he escapes from it. He's up now, as you can see. Anyway, like I say, my answer to the question wasn't very nice. I know that, and I have no doubt that I'll be considered abusive for giving the answer the way I gave it. But the reason for that is it's happened repeatedly. This person keeps going on about putting a blanket under him and on him and buying a blanket at the dollar store and all that. I could buy him a truckload of blankets at the dollar store. It would make no difference. Plus, I've got lots of blankets and towels and other things here. He will not have any part of it. He'll lay on top of something, but he will not go underneath something. And, like I say, short of disabling him somehow so he's no longer mobile, I don't know how I would keep him under a blanket. He has his free will, and he chooses not to be under a blanket. That's all. And one thing I have found, and again, this is probably going to get me into some trouble too, but I'm going to be honest here, and it's been an issue with me and women. And it's one of the reasons that I can't have a wife or a girlfriend, because I don't deal with it very well. Now, and that's a weakness on my part, I know. I'm not much of a man if I can't deal with a woman more effectively than I'm able to. So I admit that I'm not much of a man. But here's the thing. I find a lot of the time women are very irrationally fearful and very obsessive. And the fear and the obsession gets the better of them, and then they get onto a continuous loop of something and you can't get them off of it. And I think that's what's happened in this case. And the thing is, I don't deal with that very well. And I suppose the reason I don't deal with it very well, and this isn't to blame anybody, because in the end we all are what we are. And, in the end we all choose to be whatever we are, even if there are mitigating factors that may make us more prone to be a certain way. It's like, look, if you grow up in a house where there's addiction, or say in a house where there's alcoholism, well, that might make you more prone to being an alcoholic. But in the end, if you choose to pursue alcoholism and you choose to to never get the necessary help and the necessary assistance to get away from alcohol, and you become an alcoholic, even though your parents being alcoholic would factor into it, in the end, if you're an adult, it's on you. Anything you do as an alcoholic is on you. So anything I do is on me. There's nothing my parents' fault. Nothing I do is the fault of my parents. So I'll say that right off the bat. But having said that, I did grow up with a very fearful and neurotic mother. Now, she's a good person at heart. She's not an evil person or anything like that, but she is very fearful and she's very neurotic. And I'll tell you a story. When I was 6 years old, now, as you know, I sometimes talk about my dad's car that he had when I was a little boy. My dad had a 1962 Pontiac Parisienne. Well, when I was about 6 years old in 1974, the old Pontiac was getting pretty rough. My dad was hard on cars. My dad had to put a car through its paces, and he was really hard on cars. Anyway, the Pontiac was 12 years old, and it was showing its age. And it had 4 of those years with my dad behind the wheel. And 4 years with my dad driving it would be the equivalent of 10 years with anybody else driving it. My dad used to make that car go airborne on the back roads. The wheels would literally come off the ground, and stuff like that. That's how he was. That's the way my dad was. That's the way my dad drove a car. And so that car was pretty well whipped by 1974. It was worn out. And so my dad had to get another car. Well, my dad bought a 1969 Dodge Monaco. And I remember the day he brought it home. He brought it home on a Saturday. My dad often worked Saturdays and Sundays, but that weekend he brought the new car home. So now he had this 1969 Dodge Monaco, and he still had the 1962 Pontiac Parisienne. He had both cars in the yard. He kept the Parisienne for a year, and he also had the Monaco for a year. And he got rid of the Monaco in 1975, and he bought a 1969 Ford LTD. And when he bought the 69 Ford, that's when he got rid of the 62 Pontiac, and we didn't see it anymore. However, what had happened was a man that worked with my dad was riding up our road on a motorcycle, and he saw my dad's 1962 Pontiac in the driveway. Now, my dad had come home from work, and then he had left again in the 69 Dodge. And the man didn't know that my dad had bought another car. So the only car he knew that my dad owned was that Pontiac. And he recognized it. He knew my dad lived on that road, on what was called the Franktown Road. And he recognized the car. So he thought, oh, that must be where Tom lives, because my dad's name was Tom. So he pulls into the yard. Well, I'm outside playing. I'm a 6-year-old boy. This was like on a Monday evening. My dad had worked all day. He had driven the Dodge to work and brought it home, and he worked all day, and then he'd gone out again. The man pulls into the yard on his motorcycle. I'm outside. The man asked me, I guess he assumed that I was the son. He said, "Is your old man home?" And I said, "No, sir." I said, "He's gone into town." And he said, "Oh, all right. Well, okay, thank you." And he left. That was the extent of the conversation. I didn't ask him his name. I didn't ask him what business he had with my dad or anything. When you were a boy back then, you didn't do that. You didn't ask a man his business. It was a good way to get a good smack across the head. It was considered disrespectful. And so I didn't do that. We knew our place back then, and if you didn't know your place, you'd receive a beating, and then you would know your place. That's how it was in those days. Anyway, I knew my place. So I didn't ask the man any questions. It wasn't my place as a boy to be asking a man questions. I answered his question, which was, "Is your old man here?" "No, he isn't." "No, sir, he's not. He's gone into town." That was it. That was the extent of the conversation. The man left. I stayed out for a while and played. My dad came home, parked the Dodge in the driveway in front of the Pontiac, and he went inside and he went to bed. Well, I came in, my mom was in tears. My mom's crying. Who was that man? And I'm looking at her, well, what man? The man on the motorcycle who was here. Who was he? I'd forgotten all about him. Like kids would do that, eh? I got busy with other things and the man had completely left my mind. But I remembered him when she mentioned the motorcycle. I said, oh, I don't know. I said he was asking for my dad. That's all I know. Well, and I hope my mom doesn't see this video because it would be embarrassing for her and it would be humiliating for her and all the rest of it. She's not on the internet, though, so the chances of her seeing this are slim. I don't want her to see it. And I wouldn't even normally be telling this story while she's still alive. But I just want to be understood as to why I am the way I am when it comes to women and when it comes to the tendency that many women have to be very neurotic and fearful and obsessive. And perhaps I am abusive, but I'm just saying that, I come from a background where I'm going to be more prone to it. Now, in the end, I'm still responsible. Doesn't matter that I come from a background where I'm more prone to it. It may help you to understand, though, why I'm the way I am. That doesn't mean you should excuse me for being this way, but you might at least understand it a bit. She's crying and she starts yelling at me. That man was probably here to murder me. And now your mother's going to be murdered because you don't know who he is, and it'll be your fault that your mother got murdered, and on like this. So all of a sudden, this guy who just stopped and asked about my dad, now he's a murderer, and he's there to murder my mom. And now it's my fault if my mom gets murdered because I don't know who this guy is. Well, my dad, of course, the commotion woke him up, and he came out of the room like a bear, and he worked me over. He beat the piss out of me because I had upset my mother. And I mean, he'd take his fist to me. It wasn't pretty. And I got beat up. I got knocked across rooms and everything else, all because of this man showing up, and because my mom then had worked it up in her mind that this guy was a murderer who had come there to kill her. And to her, it was very real. She was thoroughly convinced that this was a real thing. It wasn't. Turns out, the next day at work, the man mentioned to my dad that he had stopped in to see him, and he said, I talked to your young lad, and he said, did you gone into town? And see, that man didn't know that my dad had bought a new car. And I do remember when I told the guy my dad was in town, the guy got a bewildered look about him. Like as he could see the car was in the yard. So what do you mean? Well, like I say, he didn't know that there were two cars. He didn't realize my dad had bought another car. And so he thought that the one car my dad owned was parked in the driveway. So how did my dad go into town? Anyway, he told my dad that he had stopped around to see him. And he was just passing by, and he saw the car, and he stopped, and he said, I was talking to your young lad, and he said that you'd gone into town. And my dad had said, well, yes, I had. I was in town. And anyway, it was him who stopped. Just some guy that worked with my dad, some guy who was trying to be friendly, Now, of course, you got to bear in mind, too, in those days, guys riding motorcycles were looked at differently. You were thought to be a criminal if you were riding a motorcycle, and that probably fed into my mother's fears, because it was just assumed that you were a no-good person if you rode a motorcycle, which, again, wasn't fair. There were lots of perfectly decent people who rode motorcycles. But it was still... society still looked at it in a certain way, and you were suspected. If you rode a motorcycle in those days, people saw that as suspicious, Like I say, it was a totally different world. For those of you who weren't born at the time, I'll tell you right now, it was a totally different world. Everything you think you know nowadays, if you ended up living back in that world, you could throw practically all of it out the window, because nothing was as it is now, or at least very little was. There were some things, but very little. Anyway, the bottom line is, the guy had scared the hell out of my mother, not meaning to. I say, as near as I can tell, he was a perfectly decent person. He just saw my dad's car in the yard. No, that's Tom's car. Maybe I'll stop and see him, because he worked with my dad, and I guess he had kind of struck up a bit of a friendship with him or whatever, and wanted to stop and say hello. That's all it was. It was a perfectly innocent thing. He was just out for a ride on his motorcycle. Nothing wrong with that. But there was perception, and in those days, the perception was, if you ride a motorcycle, you're a hood. You're no good. You're no good, Nick, if you ride a motorcycle. So that right away was an issue. And then, of course, my mom had a few hours to ruminate over it and to come up with all these different scenarios in her mind as to why this no good guy had stopped there, at our place. And then she went to the far extreme of thinking that the guy was there to murder her, which there'd be no reason in the world why anybody would want to do that. Not that there weren't people who would do it. I mean, obviously, a serial killer would do it. Whether he has a reason to or not, he would do it. His reason for doing it is that he likes to do that. That's why he likes killing people. But anyway, this guy was not anything like that. He was just some guy who worked in the factory with my dad, worked in the shoe factory. That's all it was. And he owned a motorcycle. And, he didn't know my dad had bought another car. That's all it was. So he assumed when he saw my dad's car in the yard that my dad was home. Anyway, another thing too is, in those days, a man did not go to another man's house if that man wasn't home. Like a married man, you'd never go to another man's house where his wife was if you knew he wasn't home. But see, that guy had no reason to think my dad wasn't home. Now, if he had driven by and there was no car in the yard, and he saw the little boy playing outside or whatever, he wouldn't have stopped, because that would be unacceptable. You would not stop at a man's house where his wife was when he wasn't home. But see, that man, he innocently stopped. He didn't know. And of course, my dad understood that. There was no problem between them over it. But anyway, I ended up taking a real bad beating that night, just because of the fear. And I had to live with that growing up. My mom was that way, and it had a bad effect on me, I suppose. But then when I get people now, when I'm dealing with women, and they go into that cycle of obsessing over something and fearing over something, and then you can't be right, because no matter what you do, you're going to be wrong. I can put blankets over Rocky all day long, and he'll keep going out from under them all day long. Rocky will not stay under a blanket. He just won't, and that's his choice. There's nothing I can do about that. And, he's perfectly comfortable right now. And there are blankets on the bed here that he could go underneath too if he wanted to, but he never does. He just does not want to be under a blanket. And like I say, that's his choice. I've known this cat since he was a kitten. In fact, I knew his parents before he was ever thought of. His mother's name was Brownie, and she belonged to some people who were friends of mine. And his father's name was Buddy. And Buddy belonged to my friend's landlady, who also ended up becoming a friend of mine. So I knew both cats. I knew Rocky's parents, basically. Before I knew Rocky, I knew his parents. And like I say, I remember Rocky when he was a kitten and everything. In fact, they were trying to convince me to take a kitten because they were trying to get rid of them. And I didn't want one. And it was Rocky's personality that changed my mind. Rocky was the runt of the litter. And I saw how Rocky had so much heart He had so much fight in him, He'd get up on his hind legs and he would actually box his brothers and sisters for access to the titty because they weren't letting him at the milk supply. They were purposely crowding him out, not letting him drink. And Rocky actually had to box his brothers and sisters. That's one of the reasons I named him Rocky, because he'd have to get up on his hind legs and he'd throw paws at his brothers and sisters in order to get in there to get access to the milk supply, get access to Brownie's titties. And if he hadn't have been able to do that, he'd have starved to death. They would have just froze him right out of the milk supply. You wouldn't know he was the runt now, but believe me, he was the runt. He was a tiny little thing. There was hardly anything to him, but he was tough as nails and he was determined. And I saw that in him, And I suppose I saw a little bit of myself in him too. And so I could relate to him on some level. And I found myself cheering him on, in my mind, not outwardly cheering him, but just when he'd get up and fight his brothers and sisters to get to the milk supply, I found myself mentally saying, "Right on, you go, boy. You get what you need to survive." And then when they went to the kitten chow, and the bowl was put down at the kitten chow for them, they all crowded around the bowl, and again they crowded Rocky out. They weren't going to let him eat. Rocky climbed up on the back of one of them and was eating over their head, And that's at that point I told Della, this was the lady of the couple that owned the kittens. I told Della, I said, "That's my cat." I said, "I made a decision. You want me to take a cat?" I said, "I'll take that one right there. That's my cat." And that's how I ended up with Rocky. For anyone who doesn't know, that's how it happened. I think I told this story before, but it was a long time ago. But that's how I ended up with Rocky anyway. Anyway, I'm sorry if I come across like I'm an abuser of women, with sometimes when I respond the way I do. But it's because I don't know how to cope with that. And the same is true in my personal life. It's a reason why relationships with myself and women is one of the reasons that they've never gone very well. And like I say, I'm not making this video to hurt my mother. I love my mother. And I really hope she doesn't see this. Normally, I wouldn't tell that story until after she had passed away, because at that point, it doesn't really matter. And I'm not telling the story to show disrespect to either of my parents. They were coping with their own stuff. My mom came from parents who were very controlling, and her mother was a very fearful and neurotic person. And so I understand where that comes from. And again, she's responsible for her, though, too, just like I'm responsible for me. But still, there are certain things that will predispose a person to be the way they are. And of course, my dad, he was very frustrated. He was a very frustrated and angry man, and he had some good reasons to be. He passed away in 1988 when I was 20 years old. He was only 51 when he passed away. And my dad had been sexually molested by 2 different Catholic priests in the village of Stanleyville. And I'm not going to get into any great details about what they did to him, but I will say that it was horrific. There was one priest that got him one night, and a week or 2 later, it was 2 priests. The first priest that got him and one of his friends ganged up on my dad. And they did really awful things to my dad anyway. They did, like I say, I'm not going to go into any great details. I know what they did, and I'm not going to get into all that. But it was just about as bad, short of killing him. Obviously, they didn't kill him, but they did everything short of killing him. Like, he was put through really awful, degrading stuff by these 2 guys. And so that affected him. And again, in the end, he's still responsible for the things he did. But again, I think he was predisposed to do a lot of what he did. Not that he's not responsible, because he was a man, just like I'm responsible for myself because I'm a man. But still, we all have things that in our history that kind of affect us and that send us in going one way or another. It's sort of like the old sailing ships where they were kind of the wind. However the winds blew, that dictated which way you went to a degree. But then they had ways around that too. They had ways of setting their sails so that they didn't end up getting blown in a direction they didn't want to go. But, a good sea captain would know how to do that and would do it properly. And a sea captain was responsible for the direction his ship traveled, regardless of what way the wind was blowing. We're the same way. We're responsible for the direction we travel. So, like I say, I'm telling you these stories so that you might understand where I'm coming from sometimes, but I'm not telling you these stories to excuse my behavior when I am short with women who comment here and so on. It's just whenever I do see that occurring, when I see that there's a kind of a neurotic, obsessive, fearful kind of a thing happening, and where some woman is stuck in a continuous loop and she's not hearing, I answer her and she doesn't hear me. And I know I'm going to be wrong. No matter what I do, I'm going to be wrong. I do get sometimes that I react the way I react, which isn't always the best way to react. And it's one of the reasons that I've decided, after so many years of having negative experiences with women, and also causing women to have negative experiences with me, because I'm not easy to deal with either, that I've come to the conclusion it's best I don't go down that road, that I need to be content to be by myself. Anyway, that's where I'm at. That's what's going on here. Rocky will not stay under a blanket. I don't have the power to make him. Like I say, unless I disable him somehow so he can't physically get out from under a blanket, which I'm not going to do. And I don't think anybody here would want me to do that. Anyway, I'm not accusing anybody of wanting me to do that. But the bottom line is that'd be the only way. Rocky pretty much does what he wants to do. And, he's 16 years old. That's like 80 years old in human years. So, it's best just to leave him alone and let him do whatever he's comfortable doing. And I'm aware that his joints wake and all the rest of it with the cold. Like I say, he's old, eh? But it is what it is. I'm doing whatever I can, but whatever I can do is limited. But I am doing what I can. I got him the heated pad for his box, which he lays on sometimes if he wants to. He's aware of it. And he knows he can go in there anytime and lay on the heated pad. And he will lay on something. He just doesn't want stuff over top of him, that's all. Anyway, that's where we're at. I'm sorry if I come across like a dick sometimes, but I just don't know how to respond. And when I do respond and I get the same thing over and over again, it's like, yeah, I mean, I do kind of lose my temper. And like I say, that's one of the reasons that I don't deal with women other than, I tend to just deal with women very superficially now. Just talk about the weather, more or less, There's lots to talk about these days with the weather anyway. That gives us plenty to talk about, All right, bye for now.